Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming out. Please avail yourselves of the hospitality here. Anytime you want, just go ahead over and help yourself. My name is Bill Cavanaugh. I am the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul, and our mandate is to study the church in the global south, so Africa, Asia, and Latin America, because that's where all the fun is these days. That's where the action is, especially in the church in Africa, a very vibrant and growing church, and we're very fortunate tonight to have representatives of both the old and the new generation in the church. If you don't mind, Joe, with me associating you with the older generation, still very vibrant and path-breaking. But Joe has been around and seen it all. Joe is Father Joe Healey, Maryknoll priest who has been in Africa for many decades and has just celebrated, is this right, your 50th anniversary of priesthood? Knows the church very well from the ground up and from the top down, is very active in academic theology, has contributed to the two books that we're honoring tonight, and also if you want to take a look at some of the other publications over here, there's one in Swahili, and the only words that I can understand on that book are Joseph Healey. So, well done, Father Joe. He works with, in addition to teaching at the university in Nairobi, is also very involved in leading the movement of small Christian communities. Everybody hears about the base communities in Latin America, but in Africa they're even perhaps more vibrant. 180,000 small Christian communities in East Africa, from what Joe tells me, and growing all the time. We would also like to welcome Maudlyne Ihejirika, a veteran reporter and editor with the Chicago Sun-Times. So she's just coming north from her office in downtown Chicago. She's well known in the journalistic community here. She's been awarded the 2016 Chicago Defender Women of Excellence Award. Last year, the Studs Terkel Award. She's won the National Association of Black Journalists Salute to Excellence Award. She's a Nigerian and a Catholic, and she has just published a memoir, Escape from Nigeria, a memoir of faith, love, and war. So we welcome Maudlyne as well. And our third speaker tonight is Father Chu Ilo, who needs no introduction. He's a well-known figure around here, only been here for 3 years, but soon to know everybody in Chicago. He is a research professor in the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, and teaches in the Department of Catholic Studies here. Contributing author to the Church We Want, but also author of several monographs of his own, and is the founder of the Canadian Samaritans for Africa, and has his hands in many other things, including our new African Catholicism project that we're launching and just got a major grant to do. So we'll be meeting we met in Nigeria last year. We'll be meeting in Nairobi this coming summer, and most of that is due to Stan's hard work and genius. So if you would please join me in welcoming our three speakers.
So I will speak first, and Joe will be the second speaker, and then Maudlyne. My presentation is aimed at drawing attention to three personal discoveries from our joint theological project, the Theological Colloquium on Church, Religion and Society in Africa, TCCRSA, from 2012 to 2014, which led to the publication of this book, which is the third in this series. I will highlight my own contribution to this volume and one final point on how the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology is building on projects like these through the African Catholicism Project, which as Bill said, which I coordinate. So there are three important discoveries that I made through this collaborative effort. The first is that the African Christian story is more than a single story. Our meetings help me to appreciate the fact that the African Christian story is complex, rich, diverse, and cannot be presented as one story. The African Christian story is a rich ocean into which canalizes multiple streams with competing narratives and interpretation of God, world, nature, Christianity, abundant life, etc. In his famous 1998 Macmillan Stewart Lectures at Harvard University, the late African foremost novelist Chinua Achebe spoke of the balance of stories when it comes to writing about Africa. This was the essay which inspired the now more famous TEDx presentation of Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie on the danger of a single story. Achebe wrote that those who never learn how to write their own story will be condemned to live the story and images of themselves created by others. However, he also looked towards a new world where we can see each other's story as interconnected. His words, and I quote, "It is not true that my history is only in my heart. It is indeed there, but it is also in that dusty road, in my town, and in every villager living and dead from my town who has ever walked on it. It is in my country too, in my continent, and yes, in the world. That dusty little road is my link to all the other destinations. To ask everybody to shut down their history, pack their bag, and buy a one-way ticket to Europe or America is just crazy to my way of thinking." Unquote. I am not sure what images of Africa any of you might have, but from my own encounter with fellow Africans and non-Africans, I am increasingly convinced that the African continent is burdened by what Mudimbe calls the invention of Africa. It does not matter whether this image is negative or positive or a little in between. What is to be noted is the importance of examining what one ever knew about Africa and refining one's insight based on new information. This underlies the need to dig deeper beyond generalizations and stereotypes, real or imagined. That is why I call my own approach to African studies as a total picture approach. This theory simply states that any aspect of African history and the African condition reveals significant and important insight about Africa as a whole, such that each challenge or facet of African history can only be understood in the light of the whole of African reality. In this regard, I read African history seeking for intersections, cross-cultural and intercultural forces in African history. There is always some rich dimension in the narrative of Africa which can be found through entering into the high cultural context and noetic value of African history. It is an approach, according to my own thinking, which also pays humble attention not only to internal and external cultural forces, but also to the diversity within particular elements and local instantiation of the so-called African predicament. Every aspect of African reality can be viewed and understood from any aspect of African reality. So there is no place where this invention of Africa plays out more prominently than in the present narratives of African Christian religion and its peregrinations in the continent. Such much hackneyed phrases as Africa as the new homeland of Christ, Africa as the heartland of Christianity, Africans as incurably religious, African notions of God, Africa as a continent of Ubuntu and Sankofa, etc., are often rarely critiqued by Africans themselves, and when those outside the continent question these claims, it is not often received with so much friendship and love. And I am not arguing that these categories are not true or false. I'm just saying, calling for a more self-critical engagement with these heavy categories with their multiple meanings and interpretations, among many, which continue to define and redefine the lens with which many see the movement of the Spirit in African Christian history. Sometimes this kind of categories papers over some serious social, economic, theological, cultural, or political challenges facing Africa and works against the voices and ingenuity that we find in local processes, midwifed through local communities and local knowledge. It might happen in many instances that Africans themselves are not sufficiently self-critical as to what traditions have stayed, what cultural traces remain, and the new roads which present historical challenges and complexities open in engaging, interpreting, judging, and evaluating African Christianity. This is so true in the writing of African Christian history, into which I think the group project we did belong. The Christian history I knew before beginning serious personal search for the roots of my African Christian faith is the history of what Christian missionaries did in Igbo land, and the heroism and courage of people like Bishop Shanahan, Father Fox, Bishop Healey, not a relative of yours, Joe, So if histories are so important in conveying the meaning of the past, and if histories are important in conveying the meaning of the past, and if memory, as Walter Benjamin argues, is not only the instrument for exploring the past, but also a medium for the past, how can I tell the story of my people when I have a limited access to this memory? This, for me, is a fundamental challenge facing any modern theologian in Africa. This is especially challenging for those of us who were born after the decolonization process in Africa, and within the Catholic Church, those of us who were raised in the spirit of Vatican II by our own African teachers and pastors. This is because the northern epistemological privilege given to mainstream education in the Christian academy in Africa consciously promoted a historical account of Christianity which presented Christianity to us as Western Christianity. Every other thing that happened in Africa prior to the emergence of Western missionaries in Africa was either presented as negative or were simply passed over in silence. Our ancestors, like my grandparents and great-grandparents, who had some traces of this memory of African spiritual past, were either dead by the time I was born in the post-colonial Africa, or were simply swept away by the cultural currents which were already redefining the canons of history, the map of the universe, and the limits and boundaries of what should be considered useful knowledge or negative history. The tales of the grannies in Africa were then seen not as narratives of belonging for the construction and reconstruction of being and meaning in Africa, but as merely a celebration of some historical relics to feed the fancies of young Africans, just to show them how it used to be in the past. So the folk tales, myths of origins, religious history, and African spiritual traditions were not presented to us as sources of validity of our beliefs, but rather as a scattered patchwork of the past, to be kept as past, since they belong to a negative and uncivilized notion of God, life, world, cosmos, etc. In the same vein, the stories of the contributions of Africans to the shaping of the nature of Christian mission, even during the era of Western missionary success in Africa, was not taught to us. I never heard about such giants like Wade Harris, Simon Kimbangu, Ajay Crowder, Mojola Agbebi, and many others. So what we did through this project helped me to question some of these categories and to go beyond the celebration simply of the exponential growth of Christianity and Catholicism in particular in Africa, without asking such fundamental questions like, what do we call Christian growth? Why should we go beyond sociological analysis of demographics to a more theological probing of the nature, character, identity, and relevance of the Christian faith to the deepest hunger and concerns of many Africans today? I will skip many points here. The second thing I learned from this project is a greater questioning of my locus of enunciation. Who am I writing for as a theologian? Whose voices or voice do I represent? What kind of history or theological account do I produce when I write? These are some of the questions which our meeting in Nairobi helped me to confront with greater sharpness and attention to a more self-critical approach to theological discourse. Writing about the documentation of history in Africa, Anne and Brown, in their famous book on African history, says that history may be a matter of words and shirts carefully dusted in libraries and museums in Europe. In Africa, history is a living environment. To write African history, whether it is about Christianity or any subject, requires that one must enter into a living environment and a shared environment in which all realities are intelligible, not as isolated beings, but as participating in creating a community of belonging and a spiritual and moral universe which conduces to human and cosmic flourishing. Now, our meeting helped me to question my own limited locus of enunciation as a male priest. When one looks scientifically at the emerging patterns, challenges, continuities, and discontinuities in Christian religious history in Africa, one is immediately confronted with the fact that one is very limited in his or her understanding of African Christianity or Africa. But as a Catholic priest, I also became aware of the power distance between me and many ordinary African Christians. As I listened to other colleagues tell their own stories from multiple contexts and from different denominational backgrounds, I became aware more than ever of the need for me to adopt even a humbler approach to claiming expertise about African Christianity, since I have a very limited insight into this question. I think I decided to time myself. So the final point I wanted to the final thing I learned from my involvement in this work is about Africa's place in world Christianity and the need for intercultural communication. And this is not just between Africa and the rest of the world, but above all, even internal to Africa, especially because there is even diversity in local context within African Christianity. And I just wanted to make this quote that I think that the Christianity of the future, the Christianity that will survive, will be a Christianity that must be increasingly intercultural in nature. The Christianity of the future will be a faith which will work together with other faiths and indeed entire humanity in the search for human and cosmic flourishing. It will surely pursue evangelical and catechetical goals and seek the establishment of God's kingdom. But it must do this, like Pope Francis tells us, from a place of vulnerability and humility. It must frame her mission in prophetic terms by integrating the social context and the social location of people and embrace multiple loci of enunciation in development of appropriate language and grammar of assent, and faith demands on the people of God. Therefore, as David Burrell argues in agreement with this preceding point, the interlocking movements and histories mean that modern academies, catechesis, and theologies must now see all understanding as intercultural in nature, and every act of reading and communication as translating, which could enrich us instead of diminishing us. I think already that is what the Center for World Catholicism does in a very, very significant way. And what I have contributed to this dialogue is what I call a AAA ecclesiology. I just, Standard and Poor use this, AAA, to show that an economy is doing well. And so I don't know what is the rating of America today. Whether is it still AAA? In the United States? I don't think so. I don't think so. We wait until after the election to see how it goes. But, so I thought of something. The church that has a AAA rating is one that is accountable. I call it an ecclesiology of accountability, an ecclesiology of accompaniment, and an ecclesiology of action or praxis. Now, we can unpack some of these, during the question and answer session. I'd like to pass this on to my distinguished colleague here, and one of the people I consider my idol, because this is a guy whose work I was, trying to crack to get to know what you're talking about in some of your writing as a junior seminarian. So it's so nice to share this platform with you.
I joined in the celebrations this week of the 200-year anniversary of the Vincentians' service in the USA. A special connection for me is that I teach African Vincentian seminarians at Tangaza University College in Nairobi, Kenya. That is like a Kenyan mini version of the Catholic Theological Union, C2U. I bring warm African greetings from our two editors, Emmanuel Arobator in Nairobi, Kenya, who likes to be called Bator, and has spoken here before at DePaul, and Giacomo Ezeppa in Rome, Italy. They are deeply with us in spirit. I am an ordinary and regular member of St. Kizito, Small Christian Community, in short, SCC, in the Waruku section of St. Austin's Parish, Archdiocese of Nairobi, country of Kenya, continent of Africa, world. I like to begin that way. To be faithful to this new way of being church, my main credibility is that as a priest, I have no special responsibilities in our small Christian community. The lay people are the leaders of the small Christian community. I am happy to be a student, a learner. And as we say in Swahili, mimi ni mwanafunzi. I am a student. I teach a course on small Christian communities as a new model of church in Africa today. I am 78 years old, and by the way, 78 years and counting. In our first class, the students started calling me Mzee, which is the Swahili word for elder, as a title of respect. Now, I don't know how this generation remembers, but as I shared with the students earlier today, that's the name for the Lion King, the grandfather in the movies and the plays. Mzee, elder, title of respect. When I heard that, I said to the students, no, not yet, not yet. Give me another name. So the next day they came in and they said, Padre, we have a new name for you. We're going to call you the youth from a long time ago. I like that a lot better. For many years, African theologians have searched for a genuine, authentic African method of theology. At the Padua Conference on Theological Ethics in Padua, Italy in July 2006, the Ugandan theologian and historian John Waligo emphasized the importance of African narrative theology. And this intersects with some of the things that Stan was saying. John Waligo said, Africans can now stimulate theological development. We refuse to leave our cultures and traditions behind. We have much to say about enculturation, offering new models of theological reflection. Our theological style is concerned with narrative, expressing teachings in stories. Our people listen better when you give them a story. This means using local expressions and rituals, linking the gospel to their story. Ugandan theologian Emmanuel Katongole emphasizes that African theologians like to listen to the real-life stories of African people. Stories are not just anecdotal. African storytelling is a way of living, a way of listening, a way of being theologian. It includes oral theological conversation. Importantly, storytelling honors women's stories and experiences. Stories give texture to theology. They illustrate the lives of people living the theology, preventing theology from just being a series of propositions. African theologians are developing African conversation theology. And that's the mantra that I hope we can lift up today, and Stan referred to it in other ways. Or more specifically, we can say African Christian conversation theology as a new way of doing theology. In Africa, we prefer the term African palaver theology, but we realize the word palaver carries a lot of negative baggage in the Western world. For us in Africa, it is both the name of a method or process of theology and the name of a type of content of theology, much like liberation theology. Method heavily influences and determines content and vice versa. It is a two-way process that illuminates and enriches African values and Christian values. It is similar to mango tree theology or storytelling theology. Bater describes this distinctive method or process very clearly in the preface of our new book. This is African theology as conversation, active dialogue, intensive listening, and learning from each other, described as listening and conversation. What a beautiful expression. I think Pope Francis would like it. And consensus. This is a new way of doing African Christian theology that is participatory, collaborative, democratic, cross-disciplinary, and multi-generational. Bater expands this conversation theological methodology by saying, strong dynamic currents are shaping the flow of theological discourse in Africa. A unique characteristic of this discourse is the widening circle of conversation partners. African theologians are no longer content to talking to like-minded theologians. They now engage bishops, civil society groups, and government representatives as conversation partners in a rational dialogue and critical analysis within society and within the Catholic Church. This conversational methodology breaks new ground in theological scholarship in Africa and represents a new way of doing theology in which collaboration and conversation win over confrontation and adversarial positions. The process is a mutual listening and learning, a vital ingredient for constructing what veteran African theologian Oluchukwu Uzuku designates as the listening church. Uzuku, who likes to be called Elo, published his important Orbis book, A Listening Church, Autonomy and Communion in African Churches, in 1996. To use a play on words, perhaps Pope Francis listened to him when the Pope emphasizes that the Catholic bishops and other leaders today must be a listening church first and a teaching church second. The starting point of this kind of African Christian theology is both context and experience. Many of the essays in this book draw on grassroots experiences and practical, on-the-ground research. In the spirit of Pope Francis, African theologians try to listen to the cries of the poor, the marginated, and those on the peripheries of society. This method draws on the ideas and writings of some of our great theological heroes and heroines, Benazet Bujo, Jean-Marc Ella, Emmanuel Katongole, Teresa Okore, and Ella. The last three having essays in this book. And a key point, local contextual theologies can be constructed in Africa with the local communities as theologians. Not theologians sitting alone in their ivory towers, but reaching out and listening and dialoguing with people on the grassroots level. Following what Stan said earlier, Bater developed this distinctive method or process in convening 3 international theological colloquia on church, religion, and society in Africa. In short, TCCRSA, from which the essays of this book are taken. This 3-year theological project in the currents of the 50th anniversary of Vatican II took place in Nairobi in 2013, 2014, 2015. These conversation-style theological research seminars used palaver sessions, baraza sessions, and informal interactive roundtables on African theology to provoke conversation, discussion, and dialogue. Over the 3 years, there were 60 participants from different diverse backgrounds. The 20 writers in this volume are 10 priests, 5 laywomen, 3 religious sisters, and 2 bishops. Significant is the contribution of the 8 women. I'd like to illustrate this method by using my own essay, which I call Beyond Vatican II, Imagining the Catholic Church of Nairobi I. Bater first invited writers to draft papers on specific themes, and I invited many African pastoral workers, including members of small Christian communities on the grassroots, as well as theologians such as Laurenti Magessa, into the conversation on my paper, and I incorporated their ideas and insights. Then the papers were circulated to the colloquium participants to read and reflect on ahead of time. Some gave feedback to the presenters. For example, one priest from South Africa gave me a very helpful and detailed written commentary on my paper with many practical suggestions. And for those of you who write theology, you know what happens next. Further updating, revising, and editing follow. At the colloquium itself, I presented a summary of my paper in a plenary session. Here's the opening paragraph under the heading, Be Bold and Creative, taken from number 33 of Pope Francis's The Joy of the Gospel. I quote from page 189. The editor of this volume, Bator, Jim Keene, the inquiring editor of Orbis Books, and I discussed a book that could evolve out of TCC RSA. In brainstorming about a possible title and cover, we tried to think outside the conventional box. We drew a line through the words Vatican III Rome, another line through Vatican III Rome on the cover, and wrote Nairobi I. We could have easily written Kinshasa I or Lagos I. Going further afield, we could have written Manila I or Sao Paulo I. The idea was to challenge the natural assumption that the next ecumenical council has to take place in Rome. Why? If the center of gravity of the Catholic Church is moving from the West to the global South, why not have the successor to Vatican II meet in one of the great cities of the Southern Hemisphere? My co-presenter was Notondo Hadebe, a lay woman theologian from South Africa, and that in itself shows the rich diversity of the participants. After a half-hour plenary session that combined comments from the floor and question and answers on our papers, Bator, a man of many talents, simultaneously recorded this conversation on my paper in his computer and miraculously handed me a half-page summary at the end of the session. During the coffee breaks and meals, I dialogued further with the participants on my paper. In the spirit and practice of this colloquium, using the method or process of African Christian conversation theology, I incorporated the comments and insights of the papers in the final draft of my essay for this book. A long, winding journey, as you writers know. As another example, I'd like to refer to my essay called Small Christian Communities as Agents of Change in the Fight Against HIV and AIDS in Eastern Africa, in our second book being presented tonight, HIV and AIDS in Africa. A statistic that has surprised everyone I've spoke to these 3 days here at DePaul. Today, there are 180,000, yes, 180,000 small Christian communities in Eastern Africa, in the 9 countries that we call the Amasea Regional Bishops' Conference grouping. And these communities have some kind of planned action, service, and pastoral and social mission outreach to people with HIV and AIDS. Small Christian community members are important agents of change and transformation in the fight against HIV and AIDS. Our recent research clearly documents that the active involvement of SCC members in reaching out to people with HIV and AIDS are responders, healthcare workers, caregivers, and counselors, and they make a difference. They're also called volunteer community healthcare workers and home-based care providers. SCC members have a special opportunity to minister to families and couples affected by HIV and AIDS, such as caring for millions of AIDS orphans, and counseling discordant couples. Now, a historical perspective. This ministry is a pastoral and social priority for the Catholic Church in Eastern Africa. It is significant and very disappointing that HIV and AIDS were not specifically mentioned in the 39 questions of the original questionnaire for the World Synod of Bishops' first session on family and marriage in Rome in October 2014. Some African countries, such as Kenya, did not even mention HIV and AIDS in its answer to the last question: what other challenges or proposals do you consider urgent or necessary to treat? The coordinator of the compilation of answers in Kenya said this was an oversight due to the pressure of limited time. But I say, sorry, this is not acceptable. HIV and AIDS were not mentioned in the final report of the 2014 Synod, another indication of the Western influence on the Synod discussions and documentation. Cameroonian theologian Jacquino Esapa, who is the editor of this book, said, and I quote, HIV was totally absent. The Synod was totally dominated by issues from the First World. It is unfortunate that African bishops forgot about this also. Some good news. An important exception was Cardinal Birhanu-Jesus Surapal, the Archbishop of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, himself a Vincentian. His intervention was on the pastoral challenges of the family and external pressures on the family at the October 2014 session. Speaking of, as the chairman of AMASEA, a grouping of 9 countries, he focused on 3 pastoral challenges that face Catholic families in Africa today. First, poverty. Second, migration. And third, the HIV virus and AIDS disease that create division in the family and frequently divorce. Usually both parents are affected and sometimes both die, leaving children under the care of grandparents. It's very important to understand that these 3 challenges are interconnected and interrelated and are part of Africa's overall cultural, economic, political, religious, and social context and reality. One report states 71% of the 35 million people living with HIV and AIDS in the world live in sub-Saharan Africa. Let me repeat that. 71% of the 35 million living with HIV and AIDS in the world live in sub-Saharan Africa. The call by UNAIDS to close the gap around access to HIV services will not be met unless the delivery of antiretroviral treatment is radically reshaped into community-led approaches that adapt to the realities of those living with AIDS. Meanwhile, commentators in North America and Europe merely say that HIV and AIDS problems are being handled and controlled by medicine. That is the cocktail of antiretroviral drugs. Now, 2 final takeaways. In the spirit of the pastoral challenges of Pope Francis, the final section of my essay in The Church We Want proposes pastoral solutions to 2 meanings of the Eucharistic famine in Africa. First, ordination of married community deacons or locally ordained ministers, what we call married priesthood. And second, African stages of marriage. Let our conversation, discussion, and discernment on these pastoral challenges in Africa evolve and grow. Second, we are organizing a total of 12 book events around the world to help promote, market, and distribute these 2 important books on Africa. DePaul is event number 5. Elo is creating a discussion forum in the Bulletin of Ecumenical Theology, both the print version and, more importantly, the digital or electronic version that is on the website of the DePaul University Library. All of us are invited to contribute to this forum on topics related to these 2 important books on Africa by posting our comments and further insights. We hope that a rich and online conversation and exchange will take place in this forum on the internet. This is a perfect way for our African Christian conversation theology to develop and grow. The voices of Africa are important. We have to continue to emphasize that Africa matters. We can share the gifts of Africa with the global church and world society. In the spirit of the collaborative, collegial, and synodal style of our African conversation theology, let us follow the well-known African proverb that is also very popular in Western countries. If you want to walk fast, walk alone. If you want to walk far, walk together. Thank you.
Good evening. Look at that. Good afternoon. Sometimes, as a journalist, when you're running from one story to the other, you can lose track of what time of day it is. I want to first of all say I am so happy to be here. So happy to be here. And I have to thank my good friend Stan for inviting me to join you tonight. And I am humbled, beyond humbled, to meet someone of your stature. I thank you so much for sharing today. And I am excited to learn more from these 2 esteemed individuals. What I can contribute to the conversation is much less academic, and it is really my personal experience. I can tell you that I completely plugged into what Stan was saying about how, for so many of us, the understanding that we have of African theology and religion and history begins after the missionaries. In terms of African Christianity, I should say, begins after the missionaries, and that we are encouraged not to talk or delve too deeply into pre-missionary Africa. Me in particular, Nigeria is where I'm from, and so it's that, as he said, it's that negative connotation that until the West came and saved us and brought Christianity to us, everything before that was negative. Everything before that was primitive, uncivilized, etc. And these are unfortunate connotations, and really it is part and parcel of the greater stereotypes and skewed perspectives that we receive regarding Africa or Black and brown people as a whole. And so, I was listening and I was thinking to myself, well, yeah, in college when I studied Africa's history, when it came to religion, it began with the arrival of Christianity, from the missionaries. And most definitely, it was portrayed as anything before that was negative and uncivilized. So I never really thought about that. It wasn't until, post-college and beginning my journalism career that I began to recognize the global shades of racism and that played into what I was taught. We can go back to something as colloquial as the miseducation of the Negro, and thinking about what I believe occurs in education. And so it's very interesting that it wasn't until later that I realized, wait a minute, there's so much more. There's so much more to be taught about my country and the continent that was withheld. It was not part of the curriculum. It wasn't even thought about to be included in the curriculum. So I find it fascinating, this discussion of African theology, and I have some questions. When we talk about theology and we talk about African theology, the difference between African theology and Western theology or Asian theology, and so some of these hues that were discussed are very interesting, and they speak to, I'm understanding how we serve religion, how we nurture through faith, and what is needed to break through barriers and to connect with those who are receiving. And so I think it's really fascinating. One of the things that you talked about when you talked about the small Christian communities, I have some questions. I wondered, okay, well, what is a small Christian community? Is it a Catholic community? Is it what religion are these communities? Are they centered around a church, etc.? But one of the things that I heard from both were that really at its heart, it's about how do you reach another? How do you reach another? How do you serve? How do you serve? And it's some of these things that I, as a layperson, have been digesting and debating with other lay people since this new Pope came in. He has turned the church on its head from my lay perspective, and really focused in on how do we serve, how do we connect, how do we help, and do the definitions, do the accepted. I'm not sure how I'm putting it, but it's really, the first rule is to love. That's what he's come in and said. And let's proceed from there. And so therefore, let's embrace all. Let's embrace the other. And I find that, very refreshing. And that's the theme I pick up from both. It's all about how do you reach these sectors of Africa, that are wrestling with such incredible issues. We talk about poverty, we talk about those marginalized. It doesn't even begin to reach, the poverty here doesn't even begin to touch that. So when the Catholic Church here in the West, in America, struggles to reach those who are marginalized, those who are living in poverty, we can only look at the Chicago Archdiocese and the diminishing of parishes throughout urban communities. There's the Catholic population has gone down. It continues to go down. And in urban communities, Catholic schools are closing. Catholic parishes are closing. So if there is difficulty, if there is a challenge reaching marginalized communities in America, in the West, imagine how much greater the challenge in Africa. And so these are some of the things that theologians are tackling and I find it fascinating. I just want to speak a little bit about my own personal experience because it's all I can offer. And I came here as a refugee of the Nigerian Biafran War. And my family arrived here on June 9th, 1969, with the clothes on our backs. And so, when we look back there, it's the underpinnings, the very foundation of the religious wars, that the civil wars and, that far too often come back to religion and come back to faith. So I come from the perspective of, barely escaping with my life. My mother and 6 siblings arrived here in Chicago, through miracles of God. So I sit here as a devout Catholic of very strong faith that was passed along to me from parents who were converted to Catholicism by the missionaries, and so what I know, all I have of my faith, I owe to the missionaries. And so there's so many hues for me in my own personal story because my family was saved by 5 white families on the North Shore. My father was attending school here at Northwestern in Evanston during the war, and for 2.5 years, he nor my mother knew if the other was alive or dead. And so we went through the war, everything you ever hear of war, and many of you of Joe's age will remember the images, I have been reintroduced to the images of the women and children dying no more than skin and bones with distended bellies in the writing of my mother's memoir, Escape from Nigeria. I relived that. So, it was for these 2.5 years that my mother was trying to keep 6 children alive from age 2 to 10, a woman alone. And then my father here, was in anguish, not knowing if we were alive or dead. And we were saved through a series of miracles that completely and irrevocably sealed my faith in God, for us. And it also sealed my perspective on the missionaries. For us, the first miracle was that a nun asked my mother if she could help. And my mother told her, my husband doesn't know if we're alive or dead. And the nun said, write a letter. I'll smuggle it. This is during war-torn Biafra. I'll smuggle it to my priest brother in one European country. He'll smuggle it to my nun sister in another European country. And she'll smuggle it to Sierra Leone, the neighboring country. So I had to go all the way around the world to get back to the neighboring country where we believe my father was attending school at the University of Fort Bay. But he had already left when he could not return after completing his degree, and he got a scholarship to study at Northwestern and came abroad to the US. When that letter arrived, it could have gone into the garbage can. He was long gone. It could have arrived in the hands of someone who did not know him and tossed it. But it arrived in the hands of someone who knew him. And in 1960s Africa, with the challenges to mail, found a way to get that letter to Evanston, Illinois, into the hands of my father. And my father was sent an angel as well. It was one of these 5 couples, his instructor at Northwestern, who asked him at some point, what's going on? How can I help? And he told him the exact same thing. And he said, I'm sure your family is dead. We've all seen the images on TV. And I think you probably should just accept it. But my father refused. And then the letter came. My father showed him the letter, and this instructor and his wife joined with 4 other couples from Highland Park, Northbrook, Glenview, Evanston, in the most Herculean effort to find my family in the middle of a raging war, and then bring us out. So, for me, when I talk about theology, you know, my eyes can get a little glazed over trying to bring it home. What does it really mean? What are we talking about? And so for me, you know, that faith that we talk about, the Christianity in Africa, that's my story. That's what Christianity in Africa means to me. It means missionaries who gave my mother, who introduced my parents to Catholicism, and then who helped my mother with that initial smuggling out of the letter to save our lives. So I don't know much about pre-missionary Nigeria. And it's only in recent years, as I strive to learn more about the continent and more about my own country, that, I've been here since age 5, right? So it's a different perspective. It becomes a skewed, Americanized perspective. And then you have to come back. You have to fight to peel back the layers and get back to the core. And so that's my journey. One of the things that I'm really interested in is the perspective of the women who have contributed essays in this book. There's so much debate today about, you know, women in the church that I find it fascinating. And I'm really, really happy that the women were able to contribute. I think I'll stop there. But this is a fascinating and enriching discussion, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more from both of our esteemed panelists here, and also I'm looking forward to hearing from you. I want to hear what your thoughts are. I want to hear your questions, because we're all learning together. So, Stan, I'll start out with you and ask you to explain to me, and forgive the ignorance, when we talk about African theology. What are we really talking about? As opposed to general theology.
Yeah, this is quite a question, but I think thank you for that question. I think this is also a highly debated topic. What is African theology? And the question begins actually with whether you should render this question as African theology or African theologies. So here you have people like, the last African scholar that came here, Laurenti Magesa says, I would prefer that it's rendered in the singular, because he believes that there are some common element in all forms of conversation about God from the Christian perspective in Africa. And Joe, here, I think maybe you will speak to yourself, but from reading your work, that the question is not so much as what is theology as the process of actually having conversation. You see, for some then, theology is communication. So it's not really what is as like who would define an abstract concept. It is about the conversation in order to make intelligible what people are already living, and how to proceed in formulating, based on people's daily practices, how the kingdom of God is being lived and experienced, the tension, the challenges, the opportunities. So there are people also who will argue that African theology should be rendered in the plural, because there are multiple African Christianities, as diverse as, the different experience of the Christian faith is as diverse as Africa itself. So, on my own part, I would say that I am not also concerned about definition, because the definition by itself restricts meaning. So when you define something, you take ownership of it. And so to define and say this is how theology should look like is actually, from my own perspective, an attempt at deconstructing a certain version of a classical notion of theology that tends to restrict or kind of pigeonhole what one ought to do and what is to be considered theological and what is not to be considered theological. So personally, for me at this present stage in African history, what I consider most prominent is actually to enter into the stories and allow these stories to guide us in seeing what I call the fruits of the eschatological kingdom of God. What are those things, like the prayers we say, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So how is God's will being done through the presence of the Christian faith in Africa? And then the task of the theologian is actually to enter into that will of God as it's being done, and to give, that's why I say it's accountability. To give an account, the same things, I take it from the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostle. He says, having considered all these things, I have decided, O Theophilus, to give you an ordered account of what has taken place. So for me, that is what I consider theology, giving account of what is moving forward in history of those who believe as well as those who do not believe.
So Joe, you both speak of the conversation. You both speak of this African theology or theologies as really the conversation. And so are we talking about the integration of the culture in a way that best facilitates conveyance of the church and its mission to the people that it's serving?
I'd like to answer Maudlyne's question in a very African roundabout way. The first thing I'd like to say is Maudlyne's powerful story that you just shared with us in a real meaningful way is theology. You're a theologian. Now, let me reread 2 sentences from my text. We listen to the real-life stories of the African people, like Maudlyne's escape from Biafra. Stories are not just anecdotal. Storytelling in Africa is a way of living, a way of listening. It includes oral theological conversation. Importantly, storytelling honors women's stories, Maudlyne stories, and experiences. So I think we are living theology right now in your stories. And I think, with all respect to the men that I meet around the world, I think women are better storytellers. And they go deeper into the real meaning. Now, as I've traveled in America in the last couple months, I keep coming back to this mantra. And again, with all respect to Stan and this idea of reading my works and all like that, he's got a little wrong. He's my teacher. That's the whole thing. I am a student. Our sister from Congo Brazzaville is my teacher. Our two Maryknoll sisters from Tanzania, they're my teachers. I'm a student, and I will continue to be a student. But as I said to the students this afternoon, they said, well, where do you study? I said, I'm a student of life. Okay. Now, storytelling is a way of life. One of my favorite quotes is from Peter Sarpong. And he says, this is the bishop from Ghana, he says, for us Africans, religion is not like the clothes that we put on in the morning and take off at night. Religion is like the skin that we carry around with us all the time. So again and again, these last 2 months, I've suggested to people, look at it as both and, not either or. And the great value that I've learned from the African people is inclusivity. Everyone is welcome. Whereas in the West, I feel uncomfortable with the exclusivity, the separation style. We have an African proverb, there's always room for one more at the supper table. Would you identify with that? So it's a way of life. And we departmentalize religion, we departmentalize theology in the West, but I think the African charism, culture, religion, life is one, is holistic.
Got it, got it. Stan, you talk about the importance of understanding the entire history. I think the words you used were that you can't understand any aspect of African history unless you understand it against the total history. Tell us, what do you see as the challenges to expanding the perspective of the West on this and as it relates to theology?
Thank you. I think that one of the challenges is not just an African thing, but I also see this in global Catholicism. We have the problem of fragmentation. Not just fragmentation of meaning as a result of postmodernity, but also the fragmentation of faith. Some time ago, I've forgotten, one of the writers talks about one-dimensional man, the title of a book. So really, the African approach that I see emerging in this conversational theology is to see that stories are whole. Every story is a complete narrative in itself. But at the same time, every story also is like a woman that is carrying a baby, on her back. So how do you separate the woman carrying her daughter on her back? This is just translating an Igbo proverb. Is it possible? So every story is carrying other stories. And really, world Catholicism or world Christianity, I think, is being challenged to see how these multiple stories come together in the consummation of God's kingdom, the will of God. That these things are not, as one might think, to think that people's stories do not matter. It might not make sense. So for instance, what Joe is teaching in Tangaza College might not make sense to someone who is here in Maudlyne Seminary. However, because, like the International Theological Commission said in the document on theology, that we always have to see family traits in every instance of Catholic theology. Because, when you remove the creed or remove Jesus Christ, then it might become some kind of tribal Catholicism. So yes, I think that aspect of the total picture approach is not just because in Africa there is a relationship, an intrinsic relationship that is defined by participation. But I see that, in my own personal work with women in Africa, to see that when a woman is crying at a meeting, that cry of that woman, if you probe further, can explain a lot of the social, cultural, or economic problem of the entire women there. She might begin to tell you about patriarchy, about death in her family, and you discover maybe what killed her husband may have killed, that disease may have killed other women's husband in the same village. It's just seeing that every story is also my own story. And so I am not isolated from what happens to another individual. And so as a theologian, you do not stand above the community. Rather, you are actually, your theology is informed, that's what I call the locus of enunciation. And sometimes, we understand theologians as these armchair speculators who then, demonstrate the intelligibility of abstract terms. And sometimes, we did that, in scholasticism, but evidently I think there is a shift towards giving credence to these local narratives as where, Joe calls it the fifth gospel. The fifth gospel.
Interesting. Joe, I'll shoot one more question to you before we open it up to the audience. You talked about something that was very heartbreaking to me, that the meetings of the church leadership in 2014 completely omitted HIV/AIDS. And the figures you gave are staggering. I mean, I knew they were bad, and I've watched them rise over the years, but I haven't plugged in years. And to know that we are at 35 million living with HIV and AIDS in the world, and that 71% are in sub-Saharan Africa. How does that happen? So then when you said that this was completely ignored by church leadership, and then more heartbreaking, even Africa's church leadership neglected to mention this to place this on their priority list. So for me, the question really becomes, what are we looking at? Speak a little bit more on the fragmentation or the distance between the church, the church in Rome, and the church hierarchy, and the boots on the ground, the people on the ground.
Maudlyne, I'm happy to answer your question, and with your permission, afterwards I'd like to tell a story. Okay. Because we're theoretically discussing stories, I'd like to act out a story. Now, I'm a student and I'm a listener, and I'm happy for different views from yourselves during the question and answer period. I've been working with Rome through the African bishops for 40 years. I went there in the 70s first. And we all know that those Roman meetings traditionally are, as someone says, they're a cook pot. They already decided what the answers are going to be in the final document, and then they just go through the stages. We also know that the famous saying, those who control the content control the process. And also those who control the process control the content. Well, it's all controlled from Rome. Now, my reading, and I haven't shared this publicly, so I'm happy to your comments. I think the official Catholic Church is embarrassed to wash their dirty linens in public. And so we don't really get the truth when we go to those international meetings. I'll give you an example. I've asked hundreds of lay people, priests, sisters, as I've traveled around America, how many young people are in cohabitation. In other words, living together before they go to the priest, to the church, to have their marriage sacramentalized. I hear 95% across the country. What is your statistics? I'm not sure, but I hear 95%. And when the American bishops went to Rome, they didn't tell the full truth. They said less than half are living together before they get married in church. It's not true, but they probably took a statistic from some survey and then made that the guideline. So we don't get the truth. I think the African bishops find it very difficult to talk about AIDS, about HIV. Some of the African bishops have HIV and AIDS. Some have died of HIV and AIDS. Many priests have. And it's embarrassing to talk about this. And we know, dramatically different from America, the African pattern is heterosexual. But there is significant to growing homosexual activity with HIV and AIDS. But they don't want to mention that. So we don't get the full picture at those international meetings because they're sugarcoating their reports. And I think the Pope sees that and he wants to get deeper, using the word discernment, into the real issues. That's my sense. Now, I'm just having this feeling I got to tell a story because really, we don't want to just be discussing stories. So I got to stand up. So, one day, a very hungry hyena was out in the Serengeti plain, and he was looking for food. So what happened was he went along, and finally he saw in the distance two paths, and the paths diverged. And he looked at the right path, and he was panting and saliva coming out of his mouth. He was so hungry, and he saw a goat caught in the thicket at the end of that path. And then he looked, and he saw another path. Ooh, he saw a sheep also caught in the thicket. And he started saliva coming out of his mouth, passionate, I'm going to eat, I'm going to eat, I'm going to eat. So he got to the diverged path, and he said, my right leg will go on the right path, and my left leg will go on the left path. And he went further and further as the paths diverged, and finally, he split in two. And the proverb says, two roads overcame the hyena. And we have the famous Matthew passage. You cannot serve God and money at the same time. Two roads overcame the hyena.
Love it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to what Joe said about the last synod, because the African response to the instrumental laboris, the working document, I happen to be among those who drafted the second document in Abidjan in August, and I agree with you to an extent, Joe, that when we're looking at the document, that was submitted by the African bishops, the question was, as you know, the instrumental laboris, you are asked specific questions. So I could see the tension because you're not allowed to go outside those questions that have already been said. That's your response to the question is like you having an exam and then deciding, to answer something that you're not being asked. But I think that's, is a big challenge, both the synodal arrangement, because also the committees that are set up, in Rome, we have to work based on these questions. However, I did think, if my memory serves me right, that they mentioned, in the African document, they mentioned HIV/AIDS, not as a subtopic, but as one of the problems in the section about healing, But I mean, it wasn't fully discussed like an African but they mentioned that as one of the diseases that afflict families, and so that final document. And in fairness, I think what happened is that document was not well circulated. The document of the second bishops was not, because we finished the document. The second approved this document at the meeting in Abidjan in late September, and the meeting last year started so less than 1 month. So it was not well circulated, and not many people knew about the African response to the instrumentum laboris. And so I just wanted to make that intervention.
Yeah, I'd like just to add, this is a story from the ground. I worked very closely with the Bishop of Murang'a Diocese in Kenya, who was one of the 2 official delegates to the Synod. And I saw the SECOM document, and it was excellent. He told me that he saw it for the first time on his desk in Rome the day before the Synod began. And he said, all this wonderful work, and we really can't even read it before the Synod. So there's a breakdown in process.
That's correct.
Sounds like it. Okay, it's your turn. We want to hear from you. We want your questions. Come on, don't be shy.
Thank you for all 3 of you for sharing this evening. If I understand correctly, you all shared a little bit of a narrative in some sense. And my interest is more when the narrative gets ruptured. Or as Stan mentioned a little bit, when it's devalued so you don't pass it on as readily. So when it's ruptured, or through the immigration process, or through war, or it's the next generation in diaspora, and you say storytelling is so important in terms of revelation and theology, but when that is lost, then where do you turn to? What is the alternative?
Thank you. Stan, you want to take that question?
This is I don't know if I have the answer, I must admit, Simon. This the challenge of ruptured narratives. Last year we were at Boston University at the Center for Global Christianity, and there is a volume that is coming out about narratives in African Christian history. Boundaries and what's the other part? I've forgotten the second part of it. But this was a question that came up. Since in African Christian history, what the Dictionary of African Christian Biography is trying to do is to write African Christian history through the lives of those who lived it. So it's a big online database. But then the question is, how do you bring together traces of history, when people have migrated from even one social location to another, and how authentic are those oral collections, especially in a culture that didn't keep documentation. And I must say that I don't know exactly how this plays out. I mean, I've tried to look at the work of Paul Ricoeur, and how he says that recorded history in itself does not, by its very nature, it does not exhaust the whole range of meaning. But when I talk about just thinking about that in terms of African history, that these traces of history can be pieced together, especially in different cultural artifacts that are scattered all over. It could be through songs, proverbs, and also moral traditions that persist. But in terms of, again, how do you talk about what is valid, you're not looking so much as looking at factual narrative as much as looking at the truth content of those narratives in terms of how it helps people to make sense of where they are today in history. So I don't know exactly how you trace that, but I think one has to be faithful to every occurrence of meaning especially through these performances that you find in traditional African society, as well as, like say, Maudlyne's history. When you go back to your village, there are traces of your history. I mean, it's so surprising how you can find this in, especially in myths and in proverbs. So that's what I can say. Maybe others can contribute to that, but I don't think I have worked this out myself.
Yes, thank you.
And of course, you can go back and find them for the stories, right? And that's very powerful because the stories can live thousands and thousands of years. My question is for you, Reverend Stan. You mentioned several times cosmic flourishing. I was just wondering exactly what you meant by that, if you can break that down and unpack that for us. Cosmic flourishing?
Yeah, the idea of thank you. The idea of cosmic flourishing actually I translate from my mother tongue, which is Igbo. We call Ezindo or Ujundo, abundant life. Abundant life means that there is harmony in creation, that there is justice, there is order, and there is wholeness. Because people are not fragmented, but rather that in spite of the fragmentation, the disasters, that somehow the spiritual hands of God and the life of the community, the relationship, even within the valleys of history, are somehow in an African understanding of cosmic, human and cosmic flourishing. That is what is considered wholeness. So it is actually something that is rich in modern day conversation about eco-spirituality, that there is a connection between everything, what many people in African philosophy calls the vital principle. There is an intrinsic relationship, Ubuntu, between all things. And that when there is war, when there is division, when people are dying from HIV/AIDS, I heard a pastor preach that even the earth is crying because many people are being buried. You know, this pastor in South Africa, he says, I bury 3 people every week in my parish. You know, I was at Reach Out Mbuya, one of the biggest HIV treatment centers. I volunteer there every other year, and I spent 1 week with the Comboni fathers, Father Paulino, you will know him, you know. And I was at this place, and someone was brought on wheelbarrow. He was gaunt, he couldn't sit, he couldn't lie down. So Sister Pat was feeding him with feeding bottle because he couldn't hold anything. But, you know, Sister Pat said, because I was really moved, he said, we will give life. Our job here is to give life where there is death. So over time, you know, by next morning, this brother was actually beginning to sit up. But the point I'm saying is that this pastor in South Africa told me, by burying 3 people every week, I think the earth itself is weeping. You see, so that's what we mean by cosmic flourishing, is when there is really fullness. You know, many Africans use that John 10:10. Jesus says, I came that they will have life and have it in abundance. That is what it means, that people are realizing the reason why they are created. Earth is flourishing, ecological disasters that we have, environmental pollution, that these things, you know, are somehow not as a result of, it's not part of the dream of God. So, yeah, cosmic flourishing then stands for this flourishing, the realization of creation for what it was meant to be, a world where every reality adds together in bringing together that richness of life. What I've seen someone, you know, somewhere, you know, call it triple triple bottom line: people, prosperity, and planet. So I've started to use that actually to explain abundant life. When the planet and people, everyone prospers, and people who suffer find comfort, and the earth, and all creation give glory to God.
Thank you, Stan. Questions? Yes, sir.
I don't know whether mine is a question or a comment.
Thank you. Take comments as well.
Let's see how it goes. Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Lily. You're enjoying the presentations. When you were speaking, Stan, you said that in Africa, especially Igbo, credit is given to the missionaries who came, and that's from where we trace our stories of faith. But I think Africans and Igbos have fertile ground on which the missionaries tapped in and planted what they came with. That's the story, the narrative of Jesus. Because there was a time we were having a side discussion in my school. Sorry, I have to put it so. And I asked a question to the group. It's just a side group. That apart from the story of Jesus, there's nothing about the faith that came from outside my fatherland, from Igbo land. It's only the story of Jesus. Talk of Trinity may be the coinage of it, but already you have good sense of God, you have good sense of spirituality, you have good sense of morality. But the narrative about Jesus colored what we have already. And so, when the missionaries came and told this story, we found a very fertile place to close it. And that became what changed, what made maybe our people to embrace Christianity and Catholicism the way they did. So, I also think that credit should be given to the
Amen. Amen to that. Joe, would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Well, if I could comment,
Yes.
please. And again, I refer back to Maudlyne's questions about small Christian communities. Well, what are they? They are the people. They are the church. And we have big signs in East Africa. We are the church. It's not the priests and the sisters and the brothers, but the new model of church. The lay people are fully members of the church and fully responsible. Unfortunately, we have a long history in Africa of patriarchal style, hierarchical style, and clerical style. And I think we have to turn that upside down. I like this idea of the Pope, which I shared in one of the classes today. He said, we have the traditional pyramid model of the church. We have the Pope, the bishops, the priests, the sisters, the brothers, and at the very bottom, we have at the base, the lay people. And at the very, very bottom are the women. He says, let's turn that pyramid upside down, an inverted pyramid. So the lay people are at the top, in the wide base. And then they have more of a deliberative voice. So I think we really have to have a change in our thinking of what models of church. And the Pope says again and again, collegiality, decentralization. He loves this word synodality. Well, what does it mean? It means on the journey, we're all together, sharing and suffering together, learning together, discerning together. A final comment, and I might get into trouble on this one, but I'd love to have a chat with Maudlyne later about our both being journalists. You see, I've been a journalist for 48 years. So I think we have to work harder on our language. And I'd like to make a couple suggestions which may get me into trouble. I never use the word missionary by itself anymore. What do you mean missionary? There's more African missionaries than there are expatriate missionaries. Do we think of that? We always think of the white missionary. We have to think of it in a new language. There's so many local lay people who are now being sent. In Kenya, we have the Catholic lay missionary movement. And these people are going from the more Catholic areas to the north, up among the nomads. And these are real missionaries. So I think that's one. Another one is my friend Laurenti Magessa and I have fought this battle for years, and Stan was there at the battle. Laurenti says, do not use the word African traditional religion. That's an old model of thinking. We fought with the French-speaking theologians on that. He says, African religion is one. Traditional is pejorative today. Old-fashioned, a long time ago, get rid of it. And he says, rather use the word African religion, and it is equal to all the other world religions.
Steve, you want to add to that?
I just want to use the distinction made by the church historian Justo Gonzalez, to maybe that helps actually to make some clarification why we do have the challenge that Joe just pointed out, and I think that Mike is also asking. He makes a distinction between mission history and church history. And I think the problem we have had a lot, not only in African Christianity, but also in Asian Christianity, that when you write church history, you are only writing about bishops, priests, and popes, and maybe the outstanding founders of religious congregation. And so it becomes problematic because the mission of God is bigger than just the mission of the church that is often restricted to an account of what the church representatives, especially the hierarchy, had accomplished in a particular region. So yes, when you talk about the mission of God, you are actually looking at, and these are my own thinking, you are looking at the Christian faith crossing different cultural and spiritual boundaries. And as it does, Christianity is like a pilgrim faith, that continues to take within it many different hues and colors according to different contexts where it touches. So unfortunately, when the account is given, when you look at any of the accounts of history in Africa, you're more, especially in the Catholic Church, you're looking at when this missionary arrived and what he did or what she did, how they built the diocese, how they started the parish. Yes, and then people are forgetting that the people who did the groundwork, the people who were on the frontiers, were the catechists, those who were doing the translation, teaching the Western missionaries the language, helping them to understand. So it is trying to, and this goes back to Eusebius. Eusebius in his history volumes about ecclesiastical history, when he said that the church is not a historical subject. So, and I think Ratzinger also noted that in the speech, famous speech he gave on, the hermeneutic of continuity and discontinuity in the interpretation of Vatican II, about the church not being a historical subject. And that being said, that maybe there is some form of essentialized understanding of church. And unfortunately, that essentialized understanding is always pervaded through the narratives of the hierarchy. So what we're seeing, especially among our group, is an attempt to begin to give voice to what is going on in the grassroots as a way of recovering as much as possible. Not so much recovering as a way of giving, like Emmanuel Katongola would say, is the portraiture. So we are now painters, but the paint, what we are drawing is trying to give an account of what people are doing and saying, and seeing how this actually fits into the design of God, and how it also brings about the realization of the reign of God in our cultural history. So hopefully, I think this is a process. This is just beginning, and it's kind of a Copernican revolution, because this is difficult. A lot of times, and this is one thing I wanted to point out, even though we had pastors and bishops joining our conversation, it is still very difficult. African theological conversation is not influencing a lot of pastoral decisions in our churches, and I don't know the solution to this.
In our churches?
In Africa, it is,
itself.
yes, it's often not influencing a lot of things. And I know, at least in Nigeria, that African theology is not among the major courses you take in order to get your bachelor's degree in theology to become a priest in Nigeria. It's not. It's only studied only in the first 2 years. Then the rest, you don't take an examination on African theology in order to qualify to be a priest. It's not included.
Thanks, Dan. You wanted to add?
Well, just a proverb. I like to use a proverb for every occasion. And there's many versions of this, but one proverb goes, "Until the lions tell their own stories, our story will have the bias of the hunter."
I've always loved that proverb, actually. Questions? We have time for 2 more questions. Yes, please.
I have a question for Father Healey. So my great uncle is a priest in Hispaniola. He travels back between Haiti and DR, and much like you, he's assimilated into their culture. And I'm just wondering if you face any challenges trying to take on their culture, and if you face any hard opposition to the message that you were trying to teach.
That's a great question. Thank you.
I have here in our audience some other Maryknollers, and I'll share what we feel was our journey in Africa. Maryknollers went out to share the life of the people, and so we worked very hard at learning the local languages and customs, and we felt very at home living in simple huts out in the villages. And we tried to listen to the people and come up with their felt needs. Now, my honest and humble response is we can only do that to a certain level. We really can't share the life of the people in the economic or even cultural sense. But the African people have said to me, it's not how good your language is or how many skills you have, if you're with us. That's what counts. And the Maryknollers who have stayed in South Sudan during the recent genocide, they're not there to change things, they're to share the suffering and the life of the people. So to me, that's the deepest experience of mission, sharing the life of the people. Now, just as an aside, people say to me, well, what happens when you come back to the United States and you're lost here? How long does it take you to acculturate back in America? I say, with the internet, it takes me 30 seconds.
You know, that reminds me of a passage in my mother's memoir where she talks about how, you know, as the war raged and Nigeria began to clamp down and close the borders, you know, 2 million Igbos died of starvation and in that war. But she said that as the war raged and as the borders began to be closed and no more food shipments nothing was going to get through, they told the missionaries, you know, get out. You better get out now because, you know, it's over. And that many of the missionaries that were in her village or in the city that served her village said, left, but there were a handful, and she'll never forget them, who said, no, we're going to stay here and die with the bite after this. You know, and that level of being with, it's an amazing thing when we talk about faith. It's an amazing thing. It just, you know, it's for me, it's examples like that that I can relate to, that speak to what is theology, what is the teaching of God, you know, what is serving humanity. So anyway, that just reminded me of that. And we have time for more questions. Please come forward. Yes, sir.
Good evening, I'm Manny from Philippines.
Good evening.
I'm wondering whether, let's say, in the last 40 years or so, or 50 years, when African theology or theologies began to take root, with many elements, as you have said, starting from below, experiences of people, the context of poverty and culture, and so forth. Have you, in your assessment, have there been any shifts in doing theology in Africa in the last 40 years? I'm saying this in terms of cross-continental experience. For instance, Latin America, in one way or another, through the conferences that were held with the Salem, have identified certain changes or shifts in the development of liberation theology. Although, of course, the proponents of liberation theology would say there has been no major shifts, but perhaps the focus have changed. But I wonder, how is that in African theology in the last 4 decades or 5 decades? I've been hearing about people's experiences of cultures, but I'm curious about accents. I'm curious about emphasis that's going on right now, which perhaps was missing or lacking, or not paid attention before. Have you noticed any development along that line?
Why don't we have both of our panelists speak to that?
I think my own account will be that what I consider three shifts that I think have taken place. First, in the 1950s, it was about independence, you know, African liberation, which was exemplified in the famous saying of the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. He says, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and every other thing will be added unto you." So theology was also caught in this unexamined, you know, innocent romantic ideals about that just winning political independence will also bring about this emergence of a new Africa. So on the other side of it, the theologians and felt that indigenization was going to bring about a renewal of African Christianity, and indeed there was a strong ferment for a truly contextualized African theology. Really, one of the greatest proponents was actually a convert from Islam, who founded the Society for African Culture, that held series, two major conferences, one in Rome and the other one in Paris, shortly before the Second Vatican Council. And so when, I understand that when Pope then, before he became Pope Paul VI, when he visited Africa even as a cardinal, he was asking questions about this Society for African Culture. However, and I think through the help of Joe, then eventually I found that document of SECAM in French about that's the second phase after the Second Vatican Council, and people were coming to realization that gaining political independence is not going to be just simply the answer, because I mean the war in Biafra, the war in Congo, which continues today as the longest war in Africa, you know, all these kind of unfolded, coup d'etat all over. At the same time, even like in Nigeria, one of the first objects of the attack by some political forces in Nigeria was to ask the missionaries to leave. There was an embargo on missionaries, you know, saying missionaries go home, you know. So the second phase was thinking that there is some kind of conspiracy theory. You know, we need to have, and this was also consistent, it's not just an African movement, the black is beautiful, the black consciousness movement. That was the phase. So the first phase will be a phase of these romantic ideals for African liberation at all levels, political, economic, cultural, theological. Then the second phase was the beginning of what you might call a post-missionary African Christianity, because theology was also accompanying, coming actually after the experience of Christianity. I think it's not as if to say the theological movement was defining the shape and direction of Christianity. It was rather that the African bishops set the agenda, and then African theologians tried to talk about it. So that would be the second phase, which was driven by some great African bishops who composed that famous document, Co-Responsibility in the Church, Africa's Contribution to the Synod on that gave birth to Evangelii Nunciandi. In that document, they called for contextual theology in Africa. They also called the bishops of Central African Republic, called for married clergy in Africa. People like Cardinal Malula of Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo, actually began to empower the laity. You know, the emergence of stronger Christian communities. However, I think in the 1980s, the African Synod was actually brought an end to this second phase of, instead of, I mean, this is my own judgment, Joe, you might take a different position, but the first African Synod was actually an attempt to clamp down this movement. I mean, the Pope presented, there was the lineamenta for the Synod was not really discussed in Africa. I mean, we had, you know, the agenda was set in Rome. People like the late Cameroonian theologian was Engelbert Mpen, and Uzuku as well. We're all raising question, why is it that we're having the Synod in Rome? So I think the third phase is where we are now. You know, since the turn of the third millennium, people are beginning to say, yes, we've had two synods in Africa, but theology is not fully affecting the shape of African Christianity. So this is where we are, an attempt to, you know, expand the conversation. And I think this conversational theology, narrative theology, and, you know, theology that gives voice to a grassroots movement is where I think African theology is, and what I'll call the third phase of this movement.
Thank you, Stan. Joe, you want to wrap us up?
Well, I think the final words are our conversation continues, so it's an ongoing process. Again, I'm very concerned about language, and I'm always shifting my language. for better or for worse. I do not use the word conservative and liberal anymore. I think they're such explosive words that they ruin the conversation. I prefer traditional and progressive. Now, as I see it, the starting point is the key. A lot of traditional theologians in Africa, especially connected to our seminaries, their starting point is still deductive. They quote all these Vatican documents all the time. And I feel that's a limited approach. I flow with the progressive school, which is inductive, starting with experience. And of course, the key word is contextual theology, as Stan has mentioned. But let me give a specific example. I'm going to put a plug in for the World Catholicism Week in April. Please come and listen to Teresa Okore. She's a sister from Nigeria, one of our best Bible scholars. And she is using inductive theology through creating circles of African women, especially in Nigeria and Ghana. These are grassroots women without a lot of education, but with a lot of smarts. And she's getting them to use processes like see, judge, and act, the pastoral circle, to look at their reality and then do theologizing. So I think that's where the new theology can hopefully go.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Joe and Stan and myself, we thank you so much for coming. We thank you for listening, and we'll still be here if you have further questions. Good night.